There's one behind you.
That's good. That's good, because I've been shouting all afternoon through a mask. So my voice is even more quiet and, you know, garbled than it normally is. So, thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks to Laura for that lovely introduction. So I'm not really going to talk that much about myself and my work today. You probably weren't expecting this, to come in here and get this academic theory talk. And you know, you can't leave, they've locked the doors. We're done now. But a caveat, and that is I don't think this stuff's that important. It's not important for making comics, it's not important for reading comics. What it is important for is thinking about comics. And I don't ever want it to get to the point that it got to when I was a fine art student, where all the tutors were like, you must read these really hard books. And and I've seen it from the other side, like teaching as well. You get all these kids, little 17, 18-year-olds with their sketchbooks going, I love drawing, I love painting. And then 3 years later they're like, oh, I don't know who I am. And I'm just pretending that I understand these books that I haven't read. Right? So I don't ever want things to get like that. Okay? So what I'm going to talk about is not theory. It's not these are important things that you have to understand to make comics. It's more like, here's some ideas that I've encountered that make me think differently about the comics I make, and maybe will help you think differently about the comics you read or the comics you make. So, let's move on to my first section, autobiography. Okay. So why is autobiography so prevalent? There's loads of autobiography comics, diary comics. Do comics do autobiography better? I don't think so, but they certainly do autobiography differently. Now here is two autobiographies, two prose autobiographies. One is by Audre Lorde, the great writer, thinker, activist, feminist, and the other one is by Gaza, the England footballer. These are very different people, writing from very different perspectives. But inside, the books look very similar. And it might sound obvious to say this, but it's because they're prose, they use fonts. People say that fonts are a transparent vessel, in which, by which they mean you're supposed to see through fonts, you're supposed to see through prose. You're not supposed to notice it. You're supposed to kind of not notice it's there and it's shapes and materials. You're supposed to see through it to the meaning. And it's only when you read a sentence like, I was living a plonky life, being a plonky person, that you think, this probably isn't Audre Lorde, this is probably Paul Gascoigne here. Now, compare this with two comics pages. And these are by Kyla Roberts and Julie Doucet, who are quite similar in some ways. They're both female, they're both working in black and white, they're both doing similar styles of diary comic, I suppose. They're both from America, and yet very different images, very different styles. Instantly you can recognise who's who. And that's because, and again it seems obvious to state this, but it's drawing, it's their style, it's like their handwriting. Unlike fonts, every mark is recognisable as a mark of the artist themselves and of their body. So it's like being invited into someone else's experience and see the world as they see it, communicated through their drawing in a way that's unique to them. So think about this, each mark has an appeal to subjectivity, by which I mean an appeal to see the world through the lens of their experience. And while we may suspect Gaza of having a ghostwriter to help him write the plonky life sentence, we know that this is Kyla Roberts and this is Julie Doucet, because their signature is apparent in every mark that they're making. And this world that we're invited to also sometimes has its own style of metaphor as well as a drawing style. So we've got Saba Khan here, And she uses architectural metaphor throughout her book, The Roles We Play, to explore home both as a building and as an idea. And you know, this style of metaphor occurs very cleverly throughout her book to deconstruct ideas about belonging and place, and the idea of home and belonging as a social structure. And we've got Aline Kaminsky and Robert Crumb. Now both of those, they draw themselves in the same comic. So their marks are kind of in the same little boxes. So this is the kind of idea of the avatar, having like a drawing that represents you, drawn by you. But also, through your drawing style, a trace that's made of you. And you can immediately see who's who. You can immediately see Robert Crumb's drawing. I mean, he's a bit greedy and he takes up all the background as well and does all the lettering. But you can see Aline's there, Robert's there, and they're representing themselves through their own drawing, their own selves. It's like a self-portrait. So, what's next? These two ideas are brought together in representations of the body in graphic medicine. Now, graphic medicine is kind of something that Ian Williams, who's a doctor and a graphic novelist, started maybe 10 years ago. And comics and cartoons are really good at making the body malleable. And so it's a kind of morphological, malleable, plastic nature, in other words, stretchy. So think about Tom and Jerry, when Tom gets hit with a big hammer and there's a big bump on his head. So this is a similar thing in a way. These comics are morphological in nature, and this nature is used in drawing their avatar themselves in a way that can express their pain, or express how they see themselves through the prism of their condition. So in the case of Katie Green, on the left here, this is from Lighter Than My Shadow, she is suffering from an eating disorder. In the case of Ken Dahl, next door, he's got herpes. And we're invited to see them as they see themselves. Excuse me. I really love this book. I don't know if everyone's read this, Stone Fruit. It's a really, really great graphic novel. So in this, there's two protagonists and they're pretending to be monsters with this little girl, and they're kind of all playing and sharing this space of play. And this space of play is represented by the drawing of them as monsters, and it's literally written on their faces. And everything about these panels is kind of dynamic and fast and monstrous and aggressive. And the main character gets a phone call by the mother of the little girl saying, oh, it's time for her to come home, I don't want her to get muddy or whatever. And you can see these lines kind of wear off as in this second page as the page progresses. And throughout the book, in a really clever way, there's this return to these subjective spaces of play through these like monstrous marks, this special sort of mark making that's kind of hidden within the rest of the kind of drawing that makes up the comic. Now, some scholars think that because of this super subjective nature of narrative drawing, that drawing is a kind of witnessing, and that comics are a sort of documentary medium. Because if you draw something that you've seen with your own body, it like has a kind of truth claim that you were there in that place and you saw that thing. Even more so perhaps than photography, which we can like be suspicious of, because drawings are so easily manipulated. And there's a wonderful bit in Barefoot Gen, I don't know if anyone's read that. It's a manga about the atomic bombs from someone that was actually at Hiroshima. And in that there's an artist that they're trying to save, and they're kind of wheeling him around in a wheelbarrow. He's been injured, and they go past a kind of place where they're dumping loads of bodies in pits, and this artist tries to climb out, and he goes, give me a pen and give me my paintbrushes and give me my canvas, because I need to record this, I need to memorialise this, I need to witness this and show that this has happened, and draw or paint all the faces of all these people. And I guess it's like that, this drawing and painting and these marks that our bodies make have this truth claim about them. So comics can put you in someone else's place, and they can show you what it's like to be in someone else's body and see things through their eyes. So is this why comics are so contentious? Now, there's been a lot of Republican outrage about this book, Gender Queer, and they're trying to take the author to court for obscenity, and there's these ridiculous bannings of mouse from libraries that has happened recently. And part of it clearly is because comics are for kids, and think of the children. But I think it goes deeper than that. It's not just that comics are so easy to read that even Republicans can understand them. It's the fact that comics do empathy so well, and they put you in that place, and that's what scares these people. So speaking of empathy, the internet, digital space. Now, this is two images from recent television programmes. One of them is Borgen. I don't know if anyone watches Borgen. This is from the latest Borgen, the Power and the Glory. And that series is all about, so she is the Prime Minister, and it's all about how social media affects politics. Politicians doing U-turns because social media, says no, or the media changing their minds because of social media. And in this scene, she's just got this Twitter notification or text, and it pops up like a special effect on the screen. And on the right, this is from, I think it's called Ackley Bridge, it's like a comedy show. And their teacher, her account's been hacked, and everyone in the school has got this topless photo of their teacher. And they're all looking at it and laughing. And you can see they're all looking at it because there's a kind of strange projection coming off the top of their phone. Now, I suppose that these are serviceable plot devices, but they are special effects, and I think they promote the fiction that cyberspace is a dematerialised, somehow disembodied, almost hallucinogenic, sort of super cyber-connected space. But is that really what it's like to use the internet? This is George Wylesong's Internet Crusader, and published by Avery Hill. And this book happens completely point of view, everything's on the internet, you never see anything but the character you never see interacting with the internet, right? And drawing kind of reclaims cyberspace from these kind of special effects. The language of the internet with its windows and images and icons and text is a bit like a comical wedding. And so finely tuned is this ability to represent the internet through comics that we can see that this is Windows 98, this is an old comics, an old internet. So there's kind of weird nostalgia there as well that George Wylesong is able to convey. This is Cyberman by Veronica Mukic, which is another amazing graphic novel that's just come out. And this is about a guy who spends his entire life live streamed. He never does anything except live stream himself. And he was a real guy as well. He's died now, but this guy really existed. And he spends most of his time getting trolled. And comics, in this case, this quite loose gouache painting, can represent all that text and all those icons and all those bits of the internet that we kind of ignore, in a style that's quite far from what you'd call photographic, realism. And there's this great bit as well where Veronica Mukic reminds us that the internet's a physical thing, and for a moment we see the author, reflected in the actual physical screen of the internet when she realises that the Cyberman has learned her real name. And this kind of reminds us that the internet is a thing that we experience. We're not in it. It's not like popping up crazy special effects all the time. It's a thing that we can walk away from. And Kyla Roberts again, the ease with which we can understand that this is a messaged conversation. All she has to do is stick the little ends of the speech bubbles in opposing directions, and we realise that this is a messaging conversation. So without resorting to any of these special effects, this drawing re-embodies digital space. So comics, I think, present us with a much truer representation of this kind of experience. And why am I excited? Well, I think this is really important. So much of our experience now is lived in this way. If comics is a good way, perhaps the best way of representing cyberspace, then that's really exciting. And one of the ideas that I've come across in my conferences is this idea, of the transglossic. And the transglossic is a postmodern literary theory. And books like Summer by Ali Smith, which have kind of disjointed or fragmented relationship with linear prose, are kind of celebrated by this idea of postmodern transglossic as being better at communicating our fragmented internet postmodern lives. And they call this simultaneity. But if you like simultaneity, then Here by Richard Maguire is the perfect representation of what they're talking about. If only the postmodern literature theorists had read Here by Richard Maguire. Because I don't know if you've all read it, but it's a great graphic novel. It takes place in a single room, and you have these windows onto different times and things that happened in that space where that room is or was. So, on the left you've got 1426 or whatever it is, and it's just a forest, and then you've got 1999 and there's a little cat. And, there's different braided kind of narratives that go on throughout the book, but all from different times, just from the same place. So, let's keep going with the simultaneity transglossic. Now I'm going to talk about something that form I'm going to talk about, and I've talked about this before. It's something that I'm really interested in, because small press, what's going on in there, much more than graphic novels, can challenge that idea of form. Because graphic novels have to be a certain shape, they have to be on a certain quality of paper, they have to be, quite often they have to be about a certain narrow scope of things. So we can examine the form of comics more easily in these mediums, and this is Corrosive Press who spoke here earlier, and it's got that simultaneity again. You can read it in any way, you can read it in any direction, you can fold and unfold it yourself. But also, I think these handmade things kind of carry traces of the artist's body in kind of like in the same way that I talked about before, but also in the way they're folded or drawn on or stapled and presented. They become like artifacts of the self, precious things that bear witness to the experience of the author in the same way that I talked about earlier, but more so. They involve the reader too. In the case of this is Merida's work on the left, in her case, the act of unfolding becomes an act of reading. And Beatrice Mossman's, I can't remember what this one's called, but it doesn't let you forget what the subject of the work is. This is death. And if you think I'm getting very arty-farty now, you're probably right. So let's talk about superhero. Let's talk about a superhero comic. This is The Silver Surfer 11 by Dan Slott and Mike Allred. So this comic, I'm going to try and explain it, but it's like a Mobius strip. It starts on the top, from the Silver Surfer's point of view, and it kind of, you read it along the top, and then there's another narrative that's upside down that goes along the bottom, and they cross in the middle, and they join up at the ends, okay? So the Silver Surfer is trapped in this time loop, and he can't escape. And if you read it, you can't escape either, because it joins up at the end. You know, and also you've got to turn the comic upside down to keep reading it, you've got to turn it back to front. But you can help the Silver Surfer escape by folding the comic in a certain way. You kind of fold it over and fold it round. Two panels that weren't in contact before kind of come together, and the Silver Surfer escapes from the time loop. Okay, so it's asking the reader to solve the comic, and it relies on the fact that it's a material throwaway product. Now, this is the same comic on Comixology. They haven't even tried. Yeah, they just haven't even tried. They got you £4 now, so that's it. Which brings me to my last section, what I've left out. Because I've left out a huge amount. I've talked a lot about subjectivity, and this talk has been very subjective, because it's about ideas that I've come across in my studies, which is a kind of a narrow thing. And there's a lot of fascinating things that I don't study, so I'm going to quickly go through some of them now. This is a tweet from Michael DeForge. He says, "Not an original thought, but it's funny, stroke grim, how people used to talk so much about the potential for webcomics to make use of infinite canvases, but now everyone's stuck making the same Instagram-friendly single-panel carousels." He continues, "Went from all these wild experiments with digital assets and layouts and interactions to a format that's ultimately more prescriptive than a Dilbert strip." And this is very true. Like the noughties and the early tens, there was this digital comics explosion where you had these infinite scrollers, hypertext comics, hyperlinked comics, choose your own adventure, kind of pick a path, and comics mixed with animation, and they're all gone. Flash upgrades, broken links, dead websites, dead platforms. It's hard, and things like Comixology and Instagram, and it's harder to research these than it is to research comics from 150 years ago, because at least they still exist. These things are kind of gone. So that's a really fascinating area of comics, you know, these web comics. You know, and it's a field that's changed a lot in the last 10 years because so much has changed in technology. And then there's the history of comics, the history of representation in comics, the history of underground comics, the history of marginalised comics creators, the history of comics archives, how comics archives, or any archives, can be decolonised or represented through comics. There's stuff like Marie Duval, like Roger Sabin and Simon Grennan spent a long time in the British Library researching Marie Duval. She was the first female cartoonist ever, and she created Ali Sloper, who was one of the first British comic characters ever. And yeah, like they, you know, had to go through all this stuff because it was never signed. Had to go through all this stuff in the British Library and like identify it and bring it all back together and bring her out of the past she'd been kind of forgotten. So there's comics activism, the history of comics activism, there's graphic medicine, which I touched on, but it's a clinically useful thing. Doctors could use it to give better care. Trauma's a big thing in comics, and those kind of psychological area. Fandom, how fans contribute to comics in world building, fan fiction, things like that. Education, I've even talked about education yet. Lots of research about how comics improve literacy and how comics workshops can help people. So loads and loads. And one of the problems with comics academia is it's all a bit ivory tower, and a lot of the books cost £150, which I don't really understand, but just in case you're interested, here's 3 books that don't cost £150, they probably cost about £20, that have really interested me, and I've kind of built this talk on actually. There's Hilary Shoot's Disaster Drawn, Between Pen and Pixel by Aaron Kashtan. That's the book I lifted the Silver Surfer stuff from. And my favourite, Comics on the Body by SLCZF. And here's 2 books that I have flicked through but look really interesting that I want to read, that are outside kind of my specialty. Black Women in Sequence and the Marie Duval book by Simon Gregg, Roger Sagan and Julian Wade. So there is books that you can read that are affordable, and there's the odd journal as well, which is open access. Comics Grid is probably the best one if you're interested in comics theory. But there we are, that's pretty much all I've got to say. Has anyone got any questions for me?
Did you just want to go back to the last time?
I'll go back to the... Oops. Oh. It's all gone.
Well, we have like 20 minutes left of the fair, so
Okay.
Gareth will be upstairs. So we'll please take a look at the books and give him money, maybe,
And if you want to ask me anything, I'll be around, afterwards as well. So just come up and say hello.
Yes.
Well,
Thank you,
good.
guys.